very much. Let me use this opportunity to thank, first of all, the organizers of this wonderful conference. I feel very privileged to have been invited here. And I want to thank Professor Chandra Muzaffar, the moderator of this session. And I want to single out my very good friend, Professor Fred Dahlmeyer, my old colleague from Notre Dame, who I'm delighted to see again in this very important venue. Let me begin by providing a brief historical overview and backdrop to the genesis of the split between Sunnis and Shia. The two previous speakers have already alluded to some of the historical factors, but because I'm a historian by training, I want to dwell on some of the historical factors that have shaped the debates, the current disputes among Sunnis and Shia. In fact, we have to constantly remind ourselves that today's conflicts and debates have deep roots within history. And a huge part of the problem that we have today is that we tend to forget this earlier history and do not have a larger historical context in which to place the various issues that we confront today. And again, the first speaker, I think, did a very good job of pointing out that there is real danger to forgetting history. And certainly the troubled nature of Sunni-Shia relations at the present time falls into this category. There is a tendency in the popular media, and again we come back to the media because they shape our opinions so much, but there is a tendency in the popular media, and especially in the United States, to present Sunni-Shia relations as having been violent throughout history, again a point that the first speaker mentioned, and that they're fated to be that way. Yet if we go back through time, we can certainly identify periods of positive Sunni-Shia interaction and are reminded of the basic fact that how these two groups react to one another are highly contingent on specific historical circumstances and specific political factors. Let me start at the very beginning of the Sunni-Shia encounter, and from this larger perspective, come down to the contemporary period and offer some reflections on how we can find a way forward, hopefully, toward a more positive and conciliatory position. First, it is helpful to identify some of the key issues that are perceived to be stumbling blocks in improving Sunni-Shia relations and which are assumed in some quarters at least to be unresolvable. Two issues are paramount in these discussions. First, conflicting Sunni and Shia views on legitimate leadership. It is on the topic of the leadership of the community, the imamate, that we continue to see the sharpest and most fundamental division between the Sunnis and the Shia. According to the classical Shiite conception of the imamate, the institution began, and my most immediate predecessor started to talk about this topic, but I want to build on it a little bit. The institution began when Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, was named by the Prophet Muhammad himself as the only legitimate successor to become the religio-political leader of the Muslim polity after his death. According to this doctrine of the imamate shared by all Shia groups, Ali is said to have been publicly selected as the heir apparent by the Prophet himself when he was on his way back from the farewell pilgrimage. Later Shiite doctrine would point to this event as constituting the explicit public appointment of Ali as the first leader of the Muslim community. Ali is said to have been prevented from assuming his rightful position by most of the other companions who are the close associates of the Prophet, although a small group of loyalists upheld his claim to the caliphate or imamate after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Despite Sunni opposition and illegal exercise of political power, legitimate Shia leadership is understood to have continued among the descendants of Ali and his wife Fatima, who was also the daughter of the Prophet. For the 12er Shia, the Imamis, or the Ithna Ashariya as they're known also, the line of legitimate rulers culminated in the short reign of the 12th Imam, Muhammad al-Muntazar, who disappeared in 874 and is expected to return at the end of time to inaugurate a just messianic era. All the Shia therefore consider the Sunni caliphs to be usurpers of the religio-political authority that rightfully inheres in the descendants of the family of the Prophet. In contrast, the majoritarian classical Sunni view is that the Prophet did not name any of his companions as the successor, and Abu Bakr was chosen or selected to be the head of the Muslim community by near universal consent of Muslims after the death of the Prophet. The caliph or the imam in Sunni political theory is the first among equals and is primarily responsible for maintaining law and order in society according to God's revealed law. There is no special religious charisma or privilege surrounding him, as is assumed to surround the Shia imam. The caliph, according to Sunnis, is supposed to be elected by the consent of his community, at least in principle, on the basis of his personal virtues and qualities, such as his superior honesty and truthfulness, a sharp intellect, generosity and courage, among other virtues. Shura, which is a very important Arabic word and has actually reemerged with great force in the modern period, which can be translated as consultation, is supposed to lead to collective decision-making among believers and is the ideal in Sunni political thought. Blood relationship with the Prophet and descent from his family are not factors in the selection of the imam of the community as it became among the Shia. Sunnis therefore view the Shiite doctrine of the imamate, according to which the imam is infallible and divinely appointed, as highly problematic and not in conformity with the principle of shura. The second issue concerns mutual Sunni Shiite perceptions of the other as a deficient Muslim and worse, heretic. Again, the two previous speakers have dwelt on this point, and it is a very real problem, and it seems to have gotten worse in the contemporary period. The widely divergent perceptions of legitimate leadership that I just described to you in very brief among these two communities have had serious consequences for Sunni-Shiite relations. Although the dispute between these two communities began as a political one, it has taken on doctrinal dimensions in the course of the centuries. Thus, the Shia came to believe that Muslims must declare their allegiance to the family of the Prophet and therefore the imams in order to win salvation. The Sunnis consider such devotion to the Prophet's family as excessive and that it has no connection with personal salvation. It is a doctrinal position that they regard as not supported by the Quran and or by reliable reports from the Prophet himself. Not infrequently, as we learned, Sunnis and Shia have referred to one another disparagingly and even attributed unbelief to the other. These are the broad outlines of the major issues historically that have confronted Sunnis and the Shia in very stark terms and which reflect received wisdom. This is sort of the typical kind of the orthodox accounting of the history of Sunni-Shia relations that you will get from almost any textbook. In reality, however, things were not quite so black and white. Historical reality is always far more varied and nuanced than orthodox positions, which typically crystallize over a longer period of time. History, which leads to a sober assessment of the past and the present, and education about this history. Again, I think I'm beginning to sound a lot like the previous speakers, but I had a feeling there'd be considerable overlap between us. And education about this history is our best ally in our current endeavor to find common ground between the Sunnis and the Shia. And in pursuit of this common ground, we should remember, first of all, that both groups revere the one God and venerate the Prophet Muhammad as the last messenger sent to humanity with the divine revelation. And this is the basic definition of a Muslim. And the first speaker was absolutely right to point to Al-Ghazali and other classical thinkers who emphasize this point and the fact that this is the basic definition of a Muslim. Beyond that basic assertion, there is actually considerable leeway in differences in interpretation and range of beliefs that one can adhere to. Secondly, as far as conceptualizations of legitimate leadership go, there still remains considerable common ground between the two denominations. This was particularly true of the earliest formative period of Islam. Even though we tend to think of the Sunnis and the Shia as having existed as distinct groups since almost the very beginning of Islam, this is not historically true. What we understand by the terms Sunni and Shia is simply not applicable to the first 2 centuries of Islam, that is to say, the 7th and 8th centuries of the Common Era. What we had in the first 2 centuries of Islam were supporters of Abu Bakr and then Omar, these were the 2 first historical caliphs, on the one hand, and supporters of Ali on the other, in relation to a purely political matter, which in the early period had no theological significance. Again, our friend explained to you the meaning of these concepts, so I won't go into that. There are a number of sources, including Shiite sources, that lead us to believe that the personal qualities of the candidate, and particularly his possession of knowledge, above and beyond any other consideration, were the most important considerations in discussions of legitimate leadership, regardless of whether one was a supporter of Abu Bakr or Ali. Among the primary sources that are useful to consult in this context is the vast historical literature that we have at our command, and also the Hadith literature, whose sections concerning the companions of the Prophet, particularly the 4 rightly guided caliphs as they're called, detail their moral excellences and record some of the earliest accounts of the debates regarding their qualifications to assume the office of the caliph. And a broad survey of these sources, produced by both Sunni and Shia authors, leads us to the conclusion that proto-Sunni and proto-Shia attitudes towards the concept of legitimate leadership shared a large area of commonality before these attitudes in their classic form, which took shape sometime after the middle of the 3rd or 9th century, began to diverge considerably due to specific socio-historical circumstances. Ultimately, we must remember, and this is particularly true for the modern period, if I could jump ahead a little bit, that Sunnis and Shia are supremely concerned with righteous and just governance. This comes through very, very clearly in the relevant literature. Just because they historically differed over which individual best represented the Quranic ideals of moral precedence and excellence should not continue to be a thorn in our sides. They, after all, agree on what the larger objectives of worldly governance should be, and that is the establishment of justice and law and order, which are among the fundamental objectives of the Sharia, the religious law of Islam. We also tend to forget that throughout the centuries, Sunni and Shia scholars studied with one another, a very little known fact, particularly among the public. They studied with one another, they learned from one another, and they acknowledged their debt to one another. And we have this in writing, and we have manuscripts in which these scholars freely admit that their teachers were often from the other camp, so to speak. This is a very important fact that I think we should not lose sight of. Sunnis and Shia also express great reverence for the family of the Prophet. Some Sunni scholars, like the Maliki Andalusian scholar Ibn Abdul Barr, who died in the 11th century, can be regarded as having even surpassed certain Shia authors in the way he expressed his profound devotion to the Ahlul Bayt, the family of the Prophet. And among Sunnis, this tendency is called tashayyu'a, showing great reverence and attachment to the Prophet's family, which is a positive attribute. One should also remember that there are very few differences between Sunnis and Shia on matters of worship and on major legal issues. Again, another very, very important point to keep in mind. In fact, the similarities between Sunni and Shia law are so predominant that some Muslim scholars through time have argued that the Shia school of law should be considered a 5th madhab, or school of law, on equal footing with the standard 4 Sunni schools of law. So that in addition to the Sunni Hanafi, the Maliki, the Shafi'i, and the Hanbali madhahib, we would add the fifth Ja'fari madhab, the fifth Ja'fari school of law, named after the famous Imam from among the Shia, Ja'far as-Sadiq, who died in the 8th century, and is highly respected, by the way, within Sunni Islam for his piety and for his intellectual brilliance. A number of reports, hadiths that go back to Ja'far as-Sadiq, are actually included in Sunni hadith works. So let me start concluding by offering some thoughts on the present time and also for the future. So it is from this variegated history that I briefly described, from which I draw my inspiration and ultimately my optimism, that it is possible to imagine a very different trajectory for Sunni-Shia relations for the near future. And I don't think I'm being unrealistically optimistic, although I admit that the present time seems rather grim. But we should remind ourselves, maybe we already heard some examples, but already in the mid-20th century, the prominent Sunni scholar and rector of Al-Azhar, the late Sheikh Mahmoud Shaltut, issued a legal opinion in 1958 in which he declared that the Shia Ja'fari school was a legitimate madhab within Islam. And this paved the way towards establishing the Council for the Rapprochement of Islamic Theological Schools at the time. Okay. Furthermore, a good personal and scholarly relationship between Sheikh Shaltut of Al-Azhar and Ayatollah Muhammad Taghi Romi of Iran during the 1960s still serves as a positive example of Sunni-Shia interaction in the modern period. To this, we must add the Amman message that we already heard about, issued in 2004. And I agree with Dr. Alawi that this is a very, very important manifesto that we have to foreground in the current time. It was issued by Sheikh Izzuddin al-Khatib al-Tamimi, who was the advisor in Islamic affairs to King Abdullah of Jordan, and which called on Muslims, Sunni and Shia, to rise above the differences that divide them and emphasize the common values that unite them. Now, to switch very quickly to the United States, just to give you an idea of what's going on there, as anywhere else, American Muslims are extremely concerned about the violence that has broken out among Sunnis and Shia in different parts of the world. As far as American Muslims are concerned, Sunnis and Shia often have separate mosques. But also, they pray together on many times, on many occasions, without distinction in the same mosque. And it will often depend on the demographics of the particular city or region that you're dealing with. In the US in general, I would say that sectarian differences among Muslims take a back seat, more often than not, to the larger problem of combating Islamophobia, and that's a real problem in the United States now, and fighting for the recognition of civil rights as one united Muslim community within the current American scenario. And this spirit was reflected at the recent convention of the Islamic Society of North America in Washington, D.C., known as ISNA for short. I think that is an organization known to many of you, which took place in early September of this year, when Sunni and Shia scholars and organizations decided to join hands and issue a common declaration and a warning against sectarian sentiments. And time permitting, I want to quickly read the main points of this declaration, which are: all Muslims are one nation, even if the schools of thought are diverse. This was the first point. Such diversity should not be the cause of accusation of disbelief, murder, and the desecration of sacred places. 2, Islam forbids the use of unethical and unjustified methods of negative propaganda in the name of religion or school of thought or madhab. 3, Islam prohibits support for such acts. 4, Islam forbids the violation of human rights and indicting people based on religious beliefs, sect, and thought. 5, the role of religious scholars is to spread knowledge, tolerance, and brotherhood. And 6, the final point, Islamic organizations should guide youth, young people, to be pious, ethical, knowledgeable, and moderate without negligence or excess. Ultimately, I believe we need to keep in mind that sectarian conflict is grounded in the pursuit of political power and in ethnic and national disputes that use religion as a fig leaf to acquire greater legitimacy in certain parts of the Islamic world. And I want to end by emphasizing, like my predecessors, that this can happen turning over a new leaf and pointing towards a more tolerant future can only happen through education. And I hope we keep repeating that word like a broken record because it's so important. It has to be done through education about the other and continued dialogue between both sides that can preempt the efforts of extremists to create division and dissension. Thank you very much.